There are lives that begin at the center of the world, not the center in any abstract sense, not the center as a metaphor for importance or significance, but the literal center, the place where power and beauty and the accumulated refinement of a civilization converge into something that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world at that moment in history. Kenreimon-in was born at that center. Her name at birth was Tokuko. She was the daughter of Tyranno Kiyomori, the man who had made himself the most powerful figure in Japan, by a combination of military genius, political ruthlessness, and the particular kind of ambition. That does not recognize limits, until it has exceeded them all, and she was born at the moment when his power was at its height, when the Taira clan had transformed itself from one of the great warrior families of Japan into something that had no precedent, a family that controlled not just the military, but the court, not just the court, but the imperial succession itself, a family whose sons and daughters and grandchildren occupied the most significant positions in the most refined civilization in the world. She was born into all of this. She grew up inside it. To understand her life, you have to understand what the Taira were. At the moment of her birth, and to understand the Taira, you have to understand something about the world that produced them. Japan in the 12th century was a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. The capital, Kyoto, which had been the seat of the imperial court for nearly 400 years, was a city organized around beauty, in a way that had almost no parallel in the medieval world. The aristocrats of the Heian court, the ancient families who had guided the emperor's household, through generations of ceremony and poetry and careful political management, had developed a sensibility that was unlike anything that had existed before, and has not quite existed since. They wrote poetry, they composed music, they cultivated gardens, they wore robes in combinations of color that were calculated to evoke specific seasons, specific emotions, the particular quality of light at a particular hour, in a particular month of the year. They were, by any measure, one of the most refined populations of human beings who have ever lived. And they were also, by the 12th century, almost entirely without power. The real power in Japan had been shifting for generations, away from the court aristocrats, and toward the warrior clans, the samurai families, who had been tasked with enforcing the law in the provinces, and who had discovered over time that the men who enforce the law are more powerful than the men who write it. Two warrior families had emerged as the dominant forces in this new order. The Minamoto, also called the Genji, whose lands and loyalties lay primarily in the eastern provinces and in the mountains and forests, far from the capital, and the Taira, also called the Heike, whose lands and loyalties lay in the west, in the provinces along the inland sea, and who had cultivated over generations a relationship with the court that the Minamoto had not. Kiyomori was the man who had made the Taira into something more than a warrior family. He had played the political game of the Heian court with a skill that the court aristocrats had not expected from a warrior, and he had won. He had placed his sons in positions of military command. He had placed his daughters in positions of dynastic influence. He had arranged marriages that tied the Taira family to the imperial household itself, so that the sons and daughters of the most powerful warrior family in Japan were also, in some cases, the sons and daughters of the emperor. This was the world into which Tokuko was born. This was the father whose daughter she was. She was born in 1155, the year before a succession dispute would trigger the first of the conflicts that would eventually tear the world she was born into apart. But in 1155, none of that had happened yet. In 1155, the Taira were ascending. Kiyomori was at the height of his ambitions, and the daughter born to him that year was born into a household that still believed with complete sincerity that the world it occupied was the world as it would always be. The silk robes, the poetry contests, the gardens where the seasons arrived, in careful succession, the incense, the music, the long evenings of refined conversation, the court in all its ancient complexity. She was born into all of it. She learned to move inside it. She learned its language and its rhythms. She learned what it meant to be the daughter of the most powerful man in Japan. She was beautiful. This is mentioned in the records, not as a detail but as a fact of significance, because in the Heian world, beauty was not merely an aesthetic quality, but a kind of power, a form of currency that operated, according to its own rules, in the court economy of influence and position. A beautiful daughter of a powerful man was an instrument of alliance, a living promise of connection between her family and the family into which she would eventually marry. And for Tokuko, the family she would eventually marry into was the imperial family itself. She was not told this early. Children of the Heian court were not briefed on the political arrangements that governed their futures, but the preparations were made. The education was shaped by its destination. The lessons in poetry and music and comportment were calibrated to produce not merely an accomplished young woman, but the specific kind of accomplished young woman who could survive and flourish inside the walls of the imperial palace. She was 12 years old when the preparations became plans. She was 13 when the plans became arrangements. She was 14 when the arrangements were finalized, and she left her father's household and entered the world of the emperor. The emperor's name was Takakura. He was 15 years old. He had been on the throne for 3 years. He had been placed there by her father. Part 2. The imperial palace was a world unto itself, not merely in the metaphorical sense, not merely because the walls and gates separated it from the city outside, but in the deeper sense that the rules which governed life inside it were different from the rules that governed life anywhere else, and the people who lived inside it existed in a kind of permanent ceremony that had no equivalent in the ordinary world. Tokuko had been raised in a household of refinement. Her father's compound was not ordinary. She had grown up among educated women, among men of accomplishment, among the rituals and protocols of a family that had worked hard to make itself indistinguishable from the ancient aristocracy, but the palace was something else. The Heian Imperial Palace had been accumulating its rituals for centuries. Every hour of the day was governed. Every garment had a meaning. Every word spoken in the presence of the emperor was subject to considerations of precedent and protocol that had been refined through generations of very careful people who had devoted their lives to getting them exactly right. The women of the imperial household lived behind screens. They spoke to men from behind curtains. They moved through the palace in a kind of perpetual aesthetic performance that was simultaneously their daily life and their function. They wrote poetry, they played music, they arranged flowers, they burned incense and recognized, by its precise combination of notes, the season and the sentiment it was meant to evoke. They participated in the long, elaborate festivals of the Heian court calendar, the seasonal celebrations. That marked the turning of the year, with specific ceremonies, specific to each month, each conjunction of the stars, each particular quality of the light. Into this world, Tokuko arrived. She was 14 years old. She had left her father's household. She had left the women she had grown up with, the servants who had attended her since childhood, the familiar rooms and gardens of the compound on the western edge of the capital. She had entered the palace as a junior consort, which meant that she had a specific rank, a specific set of apartments, a specific set of responsibilities and expectations, and a specific position in the hierarchy of women who surrounded the young emperor. She was not his only consort. The Emperor of Japan was not required to choose a single companion. The Heian court had arrangements for this, that were complicated and carefully managed, and that placed women in relation to the emperor, according to a hierarchy of rank and favor, that shifted constantly, as circumstances shifted. But Tokuko was her father's daughter, and her father was Kiyomori, the man who had placed this particular emperor on the throne, and who had no intention of allowing his daughter to remain in a subordinate position in the household of the emperor he had made. The arrangements were managed, the rivals were managed, the politics were managed, and within a few years of her arrival at the palace, Tokuko's position had become what her father had intended it to become. She was not merely a consort, she was the consort, the woman closest to the emperor, the woman whose children, if she had them, would be the children of the most importance. In 1171, when she was 16 years old, she received the title that would define her forever. She became the Nyogo, the imperial consort of the highest rank, and shortly after she received the formal title by which history would know her, Kenreimon-in, the Lady of the Gate of Health. The name was a title, not a name. In the Heian world, a woman of high rank was not addressed by her given name. In formal contexts, she was addressed by titles derived from her position, her apartments, the names of the gates near which she lived, the offices held by the men of her family. Tokuko vanished into Kenreimon-in. The girl who had been born in 1155 became a figure of ceremony, a position in the architecture of the court, a name that signified not a person, but a function. This was not unusual. This was what happened to women of her rank. The title absorbed the person. The ceremony became the life. And yet the person remained. The records suggest a woman of genuine intelligence, of real aesthetic sensibility, of the kind of internal life that the Heian world's constant emphasis on poetry and music was designed to cultivate, and often did. She wrote poetry. The poems that survive suggest a mind that felt things precisely, that could find the exact word, for the exact quality of an emotion, in the exact moment of its occurrence. She was also, by all accounts, kind. This is rarer in the records of the powerful than one might expect. Kindness is not the quality that historians usually note, but it appears in the accounts of those who knew Kenreimon-in, the quality of her attention to the people around her, the care with which she treated the women of her household, the warmth that she apparently extended, even to those whose position gave her no reason to extend it. She was 21 years old when her life changed, for the first time, in a way she had not planned. She was pregnant. The pregnancy changed everything, not because pregnancies were unusual, not because the birth of a child, to the imperial consort, was in itself surprising, but because of what this particular child would mean to the particular people, whose ambitions had arranged this marriage. If the child was a boy, he would be the son of the Emperor Takakura and the daughter of Tairano Kiyomori. He would be, in other words, the instrument by which the Taira family achieved what Kiyomori had spent his entire career pursuing, not power adjacent to the imperial family, not influence over the imperial family, but blood connection to the imperial family itself, the possibility of an emperor who was simultaneously a Taira. The child was a boy. He was born in 1178. He was named Tokuhito, and within 3 years, by the arrangements that Kiyomori had spent decades preparing, Tokuhito was placed on the throne of Japan. He was 3 years old. His mother was 23. His grandfather, Tairano Kiyomori, was the most powerful man in Japan, the grandfather of the emperor, the father of the empress, the man who had managed this outcome through 20 years of patient and ruthless political work. The Taira had reached the summit. Kenreimon-in was the mother of the emperor, and the world that she had grown up in, the world of silk and poetry and long ceremonial evenings, seemed in that moment entirely secure. It was not. Part 3. The summit was not quiet. The Heian court had always been a place of rivalry and maneuvering, a place where position was never simply given, but constantly negotiated, where the relationships between families were maintained by an unceasing exchange of poetry and marriages and carefully calibrated gestures of respect and deference. But what the Taira had accomplished by placing an infant emperor on the throne went beyond anything that the court had previously absorbed. The ancient aristocratic families, the Fujiwara and the others, who had managed the emperor's household, through centuries of careful service, watched a warrior family assume the position of power that they had always believed was theirs by right, and they did not accept it quietly. In the provinces, the tension was worse. The Minamoto, the warrior family that the Taira had defeated a generation before and driven from the centers of power, had not disappeared. They had retreated to the eastern provinces, to the mountains and forests of the east, and they had spent the years since their defeat, waiting and gathering strength, and watching for the moment when the Taira might overreach. Kiyomori's assumption of effective control over the imperial succession was, for the Minamoto, the moment they had been waiting for. In 1180, the year after the infant emperor was enthroned, a prince of the imperial family sent a message to the warriors of the east. The message called for rebellion. It called for the destruction of the Taira and the restoration of proper order. It named Minamoto no Yoritomo, the exiled heir of the Minamoto family, as the man who should lead the warriors. In this cause, most of the warriors who received the message did nothing. The Taira were too powerful. The risks were too great. Yoritomo was too far away, too long exiled, too uncertain a leader, to justify the enormous gamble of open rebellion. But a few did act, and the acts of the few were enough to begin what would eventually become the war that ended everything. Kiyomori's response to the first stirrings of rebellion was swift and brutal. He moved the capital, in the summer of 1180, in a decision that shocked the court and disrupted the entire apparatus of Heian civilization. Kiyomori ordered that the imperial capital be relocated from Kyoto to a new site in the west, closer to the Taira heartland, closer to the sea, closer to the ports, through which the wealth of the inland sea provinces flowed into Taira coffers. The court moved, the emperor moved, the emperor's mother moved. Kenreimon-in left the city. She had lived in her entire life and traveled west with the rest of the Taira world. The new capital was called Fukuhara. It was beautiful in its way. The sea was visible from the slopes above the city. The autumn winds came off the water. There were moments when the light on the inland sea was extraordinary, the particular quality of maritime light that painters and poets have always valued, but it was not Kyoto. It did not have the accumulated weight of centuries. It did not have the temples and the gardens, and the specific quality of the mountain air that the people of the Heian court had organized their sensibility around. The court hated it. The aristocrats complained. The rituals felt wrong in the new spaces. The familiar rhythms of the capital year could not be recreated in a place that had not grown organically from 400 years of continuous habitation. And then the rains came. The autumn rains of 1180 were extraordinary, even by the standards of a season that the Japanese have always known for its rain. The new capital flooded, the streets turned to mud, the temporary buildings that had been erected to house the court in its sudden relocation leaked and sagged and in some cases simply fell apart. After 5 months, Kiyomori gave in. The court returned to Kyoto. The experiment of Fukuhara was abandoned, but the 5 months had cost something that could not be recovered. The prestige of the decision, the authority that comes from appearing to know what you are doing, the sense among the people who watched these events that the Taira were not merely ruthless, but competent, not merely ambitious, but wise. In the autumn of 1180, for the first time, that sense began to waver. Kiyomori did not see the winter. He had been ill for years, the burning fever that the chronicles describe, with an almost medical precision, the body that radiated heat, so intense that those around him could not stand near him, the man who had been so powerful for so long, reduced at the end to a body that was consuming itself. He died in the spring of 1181. He was 63 years old. He had made the Taira into the most powerful family in Japan. He had placed his grandson on the throne. He had arranged the world according to his ambitions, and then died before the world could unmake what he had arranged. Kenreimon-in was 25 years old when her father died. She had grown up in his household. She had been formed by his ambitions. She had become what she was because of the path he had cleared for her. And now the man who had cleared the path was gone, and the path itself was beginning to narrow. The war that had started in the eastern provinces was not stopping. The Minamoto forces under Yoritomo were not retreating. The Taira generals who rode out to meet them in the battles of 1180 and 1181 returned with reports that the men of the East fought differently from anything the Taira had encountered before, harder and faster and with less regard for the conventions that had governed Japanese warfare for generations. The summit had been reached, the descent had begun, and the woman at the center of the court, the mother of the emperor, the daughter of the man who was gone, could feel it in the changing quality of the conversations that reached her through the curtains and the screens, the different tone in the voices of the men who came to pay their respects. She could feel the world beginning to move. Part 4. The years between Kiyomori's death and the fall of the capital were years of slow collapse, not immediate, not dramatic at first. The collapse of a civilization rarely announces itself with a single catastrophic event. It announces itself in accumulations, in the pile of small reversals, that eventually reaches a height, from which the fall becomes inevitable in the quality of the silence that falls over a table when news arrives that cannot be answered with any available response. The Taira had generals, they had warriors, they had the resources of the western provinces, and the wealth of the inland sea trade, and the prestige of governing the household, of the emperor they had placed on the throne. What they did not have, it turned out, was a strategist of the quality they needed for the war they were fighting. The Minamoto fought a different kind of war. They moved fast, lived rough, made decisions quickly, adapted to terrain and circumstance with a flexibility that the Taira commanders, trained in a more formal tradition of set-piece engagements and carefully managed campaigns, found difficult to match. The battles of 1183 made the situation clear. At the Battle of Kurikara-toge, in the mountains of the north, a Minamoto general named Yoshinaka destroyed a Taira army in a maneuver so unexpected that the chronicles describe it with a quality of stunned disbelief. Yoshinaka drove a herd of cattle, with burning torches tied to their horns, into the Taira lines at night. It was not the kind of tactic that the Taira generals had planned for. Nothing in their experience had suggested that this was the kind of war they would be fighting. The defeat at Kurikara Toge broke the Taira position in the north, and with the north lost, the capital was exposed. In the summer of 1183, Yoshinaka's forces moved toward Kyoto. The Taira met in council. The options were discussed. The arguments were made for staying and fighting, for using the prestige of the imperial court and the walls of the capital to hold the Minamoto back. The arguments were reasonable. They were also wrong. The decision was made to go. In the summer of 1183, the Taira clan abandoned the capital. They did not leave empty-handed. They took the emperor. The boy who was the emperor was 7 years old. He was the son of the dead emperor Takakura and the daughter of the dead Kiyomori. He was the reason that everything had been built and fought for. He could not be left behind. They took the sacred regalia, the sword, the jewel, the mirror, the three objects that were not merely symbols of imperial authority, but were, in the understanding of the Heian world, the actual substance of it, the physical embodiment of the line of succession, that stretched back to the age of the gods. Without the regalia, a man sitting on the throne of Japan was not the emperor. He was just a man sitting on a throne. The Taira took them. They also took everything else they could carry: the silk, the lacquerware, the records, the portable wealth that could be loaded onto boats and carried down the river to the waiting ships, and they took the women. Kenreimon-in left Kyoto in the summer of 1183. She was 27 years old. She had spent her entire life in the capital, first in her father's compound, and then in the Imperial palace. She knew the city in the way that people know the places, where they have always lived, the specific quality of the light, in specific seasons, the particular sounds of the different districts, at different hours of the day. She did not know if she would see it again. The journey west was not elegant. The Taira were not refugees, not technically, not yet. They had their warriors, they had the emperor, they had the regalia, they had the resources to continue the fight. But the journey had the quality of flight, the urgency of people who know that what is behind them is gaining, and what is ahead of them is uncertain, who have made the calculation that moving is better than staying, even though moving means giving up everything that could not be carried. The court women rode in carriages, or were carried in palanquins, or rode on horseback, in the less dignified circumstances of the western roads, the silk robes that had been appropriate for the corridors of the imperial palace were not appropriate for river crossings and mountain passes. In the summer heat, the rituals of the Heian court could not be fully maintained. In the field, the poetry was still written, the incense was still burned, the forms were preserved as best they could be, but everyone knew that the forms were being preserved over a void that had not been there before, that the world that had given the forms their meaning was behind them now, and what lay ahead had not yet revealed its shape. They established themselves in the western provinces. They held the sea. The inland sea was Taira water, had always been Taira water, the heartland of their power, and the source of their wealth and the fleet of ships. That rode at anchor in the harbors of the western coast was still the most formidable naval force. In Japan, the emperor was installed in whatever accommodation could be arranged. The court continued its ceremonies. The regalia was kept safe, and Kenreimon-in, the mother of the boy emperor, the daughter of the dead man, whose ambitions had created this situation, arranged herself inside the smaller space that was now available to her, and waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned it in the palace. She was not yet done with losing everything. Part 5. The war intensified. In Kyoto, the Minamoto who had taken the capital found themselves unable to govern it. Yoshinaka, the general who had driven the Taira out, was better at fighting than administering, and the city under his authority descended into a disorder that the Heian court found intolerable. The result was that Yoritomo, the principal leader of the Minamoto, sent his younger brothers to remove Yoshinaka. One of those brothers was Minamoto no Yoshitsune. He was 24 years old. He was a military genius, and he would become the most formidable opponent the Taira had ever faced. The battles came in sequence. Each one pushed the Taira further west. Each one reduced the geography available to them, the ports they could use, the provinces that still supported them, the sea room in which they could maneuver. At Ichinotani, on the cliffs above the narrow beach, where the Taira had built a fortified camp, Yoshitsune led his cavalry down a slope so steep that the horses had to be lowered almost one by one and fell upon the Taira position from a direction so unexpected that the defenses were useless. The Taira fled to their ships. The shore was chaos. Warriors who had not made it to the boats drowned in the surf or were cut down on the beach. Atsumori died at Ichinotani. He was 16 years old. He was the nephew of Kiyomori. He was a musician as well as a warrior, and he had been known at the Heian court for the quality of his flute playing, the particular sweetness of his music. In the long evenings of the court, he had almost made it to the boats. He turned back. When a Minamoto warrior called to him from the shore, the warrior was Kumagai Naozane. He killed the boy, and found when he removed the helmet that the boy was the same age as his son. Kumagai Naozane eventually left the warrior life and became a monk. He could not forget the boy's face. At Yashima, on the island in the inland sea, where the Taira had established their new base, the attack came at night. From the land, again unexpected, again Yoshitsune. The Taira barely escaped to their ships. The emperor was in the chaos. The boy, who was 8 years old, was carried through the fighting, toward the water, toward the boats, toward the next temporary safety. Kenreimon-in was in the chaos. She was carried or she carried herself. The accounts are not precise about the exact movements of the women in the confusion of that night. What the accounts record is that the Taira survived Yashima with their fleet intact, and their emperor still with them, and the sacred regalia still in their possession. They moved to the ships, and the ships moved west, and the inland sea, which had always been their sea, became the territory, through which they retreated toward the final position. The final position was Dan-no-ura, a strait at the western end of the inland sea, where the waters of the inland sea meet the open waters of the channel that separates the main island of Japan from the southern island. The currents were complex here. The water moved in different directions at different states of the tide. The Taira knew these waters. The Minamoto did not. This was the argument for making the final stand here, at the place where their naval knowledge might compensate for the military disadvantage they had accumulated through 2 years of defeats. The fleet assembled. The Taira still had hundreds of ships. The warriors were still there, still capable, still fighting with the discipline of men who understood that this was the last available position. The emperor was on one of the ships. He was 8 years old. He was dressed in the ceremonial robes of his office. He had been told, or had intuited, something about the weight of what was happening. The accounts describe him. as a calm child, not frightened, or if frightened, not showing it. He had been surrounded by chaos. For 2 years now, he had spent his childhood on ships and in temporary encampments, and in the hasty ceremony of a court that was trying to maintain its forms in the worst possible circumstances. He was calm. Kenreimon-in was with him. She would not leave him. Whatever happened next, she would be beside him. The night before the battle, the fleet rode at anchor in the Strait of Dan-no-ura. The tide moved. The stars moved. The Taira prepared. Part 6. The Battle of Dan-no-ura was fought on the 24th day of the 3rd month of the year 1185. It began well for the Taira. The morning tide was in their favor. The Minamoto ships, approaching from the east, were fighting against the current, and the Taira archers, positioned in the bows of their ships, found their range and held it. For a few hours the battle seemed to be turning in the direction that the Taira needed it to turn. Then the tide changed. This is how the chronicles describe it, and the physical reality of the Strait of Dan-no-ura makes the description credible. The currents there shift dramatically, with the state of the tide and a fleet fighting with the tide behind it. Is a fleet fighting a different battle from the fleet fighting against it? When the tide turned, the Minamoto advantage in numbers and aggression reasserted itself. The Taira ships began to falter, and then one of their own admirals changed sides. This is the moment that the chronicles mark as the end of the battle. Not the shift in the tide, though that was devastating, but the defection of one of their own commanders, a man who understood the naval tactics of the strait, and who, in the chaos of the turning battle, made the calculation that the Taira were finished, and that survival required, changing his loyalties immediately. He pointed out to the Minamoto which ships carried the Emperor, and the sacred regalia. The Minamoto arrows found new targets. What happened next is described in the chronicles with a precision that suggests the writers had access to eyewitness accounts. The women on the ships understood. They understood before the men did, or perhaps they understood at the same moment, but acted on it more quickly. The grandmother of the Emperor, Nidono, the mother of Kiyomori, the woman who had made her own calculation about what was and was not survivable, went to the boy emperor. He was 8 years old. He asked her where they were going. She told him that there was a pure land beneath the waves. She told him that beneath the water there was another capital, a place of peace, a place without battles, a place where he would be safe. She took him in her arms. She told him to face east and say his farewells to the great shrine of Ise, the oldest shrine in Japan, the home of the gods, who were his ancestors. He said his farewell. He faced west, the direction of the pure land of Amida, and he recited the name of the Buddha, Namu Amida Butsu, and then Nidono stepped off the ship and into the sea with the emperor in her arms. Kenreimon-in saw this. She was on the same ship, or on a ship close enough that the chronicles place her, in sight of what happened. She had her attendants around her. She saw the other women going into the water, the decision being made. In the seconds available for deciding the choice between capture and the sea, she made the choice. She went into the water. The inland sea in the 3rd month is cold, cold enough to end things quickly. For a woman in court robes, weighted with silk and brocade, she went under. She did not stay under. A Minamoto warrior in a small boat, seeing her go in, reached into the water with a pole and caught her hair and pulled her back. She fought him. The accounts are clear about this. She fought to go back under. She did not want to be saved, but she was saved anyway. She was pulled into the boat. She was taken aboard a Minamoto ship. She was a prisoner. The battle was over. The Taira were finished. The Emperor was dead. She was 30 years old. She was alive. She had not chosen to be. The sacred regalia was partially recovered. The jewel and the mirror were found, on the ships or floating in the water. The sword, the ancient sword, that had been the symbol of imperial authority, since the age of the gods, was lost. It went into the sea with the emperor. It was never recovered. It remains there, in the strait of Dan-no-ura, in the cold water of the channel, the sword that once was held by the gods themselves, and that now lies in the silt of the sea floor, uncovered. The surviving Taira warriors made their choices quickly. Some swam to shore and surrendered. Some were captured on the ships. Some drowned. Some made the same choice that Nidono had made and went into the water deliberately. Tairano Tomonori, one of the great commanders of the clan, had always said that a warrior of the Taira should not die at the hands of an enemy. He loaded himself with an anchor and stepped off his ship. He sank. He went down into the same water that had received the emperor. By evening it was over. The inland sea was quiet. The ships that remained belonged to the Minamoto. The bodies in the water were Taira, and on a Minamoto ship, a woman in wet court robes, her hair still tangled from wear. The pole had caught it, sat among strangers, and was alive in a world she no longer recognized. Part 7. They brought her back to Kyoto, not gently, not cruelly either, but without the consideration that her rank would once have demanded, without the curtains and screens, and careful protocols of the Heian court, without the intermediaries, through whom a woman of her station had always communicated with the world. She traveled east as a prisoner, which meant that she was seen, which meant that the people along the road could look at her directly, which was a kind of exposure that would have been inconceivable in her life before. The Heian court lady existed behind veils. She was perceived through her poetry, through the sound of her music, through the rustle of her robes. In the rooms behind the screens, she was not seen. She was seen now. The city she returned to was the city she had left 2 years before, but different. The Taira compounds were gone. The Rakuhara, the great complex that had been the heart of Taira power in the capital, had been taken or burned. The other family properties had been occupied or demolished. The people who had populated her world, the men and women of the Taira household, were dead or scattered or in hiding. She had nowhere to go. A small house was found for her on the edge of the city, an accommodation that was not quite imprisonment, but was not freedom either, a place where she could exist under the new order, without being a problem to the new order. She had almost nothing. The silk robes were gone, traded or lost or left behind in the years of flight. The household was gone, the dozens of women who had attended her in the Imperial palace. The rituals were gone, the elaborate framework of ceremony that had given shape to every day of her adult life. What she had was the prayer, the Nembutsu, the practice of the Pure Land Buddhist, the repetition of the name of Amida, Namu Amida Butsu, spoken in the faith, that the Buddha's compassion reaches the person who calls, that the repetition builds a channel through which the light of the Pure Land can reach even into the darkest circumstances. She said it. She kept saying it. In the Heian world, the turn to religion was not unusual for a woman who had suffered. The court had always had its monasteries and convents, its retreats and hermitages, the places where people went when the world became unbearable, or when the world became irrelevant. when the things that the world offered were no longer sufficient compensation for the things it cost. Women of high rank had been making this choice for generations. Gyo, who had been one of her father's favorites, had made it. Others had made it before her. The path existed. It was understood. The question was not whether she would take it, but when and in what form and what would be left of her when she arrived at the other end of it. In the 5th month of 1185, within weeks of Dan-no-ura, she took the vows. A nun cut her hair. She put on the black robes of the renunciate. She received the precepts and the new name and the formal acknowledgement of the religious community that she had entered. The Heian world had a word for this transition. It was called Nudo, the entering of the way. It meant a formal break. With the secular world, a commitment to the path of the Buddha. That was meant to be permanent. She made that break. She made that commitment. But the small house on the edge of the city was not the right place for what she had become. A nun needed a temple, a woman who had decided that the world was behind her, needed the architecture of the religious life, the daily rhythms of service and meditation and prayer. That gave the spiritual life its necessary structure. She needed to go further. She needed to go somewhere. That was not the city, not the place of her former life, not the streets and buildings, and constant reminders of what had been and was not anymore. She needed to go to Ohara. Ohara is a mountain valley north of Kyoto, not far in distance, but far in every other sense. A narrow road leads into the mountains. From the edge of the city, the road climbs for several hours before it enters the valley, and when it enters the valley is enclosed on 3 sides by wooded mountains that cut off the noise and movement of the capital as completely as if they were walls. A river runs through the valley. The sound of the water is constant. There are temples in the valley, small ones, temples that had been built over the centuries by people who needed exactly what Ohara offered: distance, quiet, the particular quality of mountain silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a sound that is continuous enough to become a kind of silence. She went there. Part 8. Jakko-in, the Temple of Still Light. The name is a translation, an approximation, an attempt in English to carry the weight of a Japanese phrase. That means something like the light that has become still, the illumination that is not movement, but rest, the particular quality of sacred light. In the Heian Buddhist imagination, which is not the harsh light of day, but the softer light of the Pure Land, the light that does not disturb, but illuminates. The temple had been there for centuries. The tradition holds that it was founded by Shotoku Taishi, the great prince of the 6th century, who brought Buddhism to Japan from the Korean peninsula, and who built in the decades of his life more temples than most rulers build in their lifetimes. Whether Shotoku Taishi actually founded this particular temple is a question that historians approach with care. The attribution may be legendary. The devotion that the legend reflects is not. The temple sat at the edge of the valley. The mountains rose behind it. The cedar forest began, where the last buildings ended. Below the temple, a small pond caught the light in the mornings and the evenings, and reflected the mountains back upward in a way that made the world seem doubled, the real mountains above, and the water mountains below, both equally still, both equally permanent. A garden had been cultivated around the pond, not the elaborate managed garden of the Heian Palace, not the kind of garden that requires dozens of gardeners, and careful seasonal attention, and the continuous application of aesthetic judgment to maintain its effects. A simpler garden, one that worked with the mountain climate. rather than against it, that allowed the wildflowers to grow where they grew, and the mosses to cover what they covered, and the autumn colors to arrive in their own sequence without being arranged. Kenreimon-in came to this place. She came with a small number of attendants, women who had survived what she had survived, and who had chosen to follow her into the mountain valley. Awano Naishi was one of them, a woman of the Heian court, one of the ladies who had attended Kenreimon-in in the Imperial palace, who had been with her through the flight west, and the years on the ships, and the chaos of Dan-no-ura. She had made the same choice. She had not gone into the sea. She had survived and followed her mistress into the aftermath. The life they established in Ohara was stripped of everything that had defined the life before. No silk. They wore plain robes, the simple undyed cloth of the religious life. No palace. They lived in small buildings that were adequate but not more than adequate. Buildings that provided shelter, without the aesthetic elaboration that had always surrounded them before. No ceremony, or rather, the ceremony was different. The ritual structure of the day was not the elaborate schedule of the Heian court calendar, but the simpler, more repetitive structure of the monastic day. Prayers in the morning, prayers in the evening, the recitation of sutras, the maintenance of the temple, the attention to the small tasks of the religious life. And there was the garden. Kenreimon-in tended it. This is mentioned in the accounts, with a specificity that suggests it was understood to be important, not a detail, but a fact. She gathered the wild flowers of the mountain valley. She placed them at the altar. She knew the names of the flowers, and when they bloomed, and what they were called in the classical poetry. She had learned as a child the flowers of Ohara were not the flowers of the capital garden. They were smaller, more austere, the flowers that grow in rocky soil, at altitude that do not require cultivation, but bloom in their season, regardless of whether anyone is watching. She watched. She gathered them. She arranged them. She set them before the image of Amida, and recited the name of the Buddha, and let the mountain light fall where it fell. The days were not empty. This is something that people who have not lived a contemplative life sometimes misunderstand about it. The contemplative life is not empty. It is full in a different way, from the way that ordinary life is full of the kind of attention that ordinary life rarely allows, attention to the quality of the light, at a specific hour to the particular sound of rain, on a specific kind of roof to the texture of time itself, as it passes through a day. That is not rushed, that is not organized around the production of particular outcomes, that simply is what it is. She had lost everything. She was also, in the mountain valley, fully present, in a way that the years of ceremony had not always allowed. She prayed for the dead, for her father Kiyomori, who had built the world, that was now gone, for her husband Takakura, who had died young before the worst had happened, for the warriors of the Taira, the men who had fought and died in the Western Sea, for Atsumori, her nephew, the boy with the flute, for Nidono, the grandmother who had held the emperor and stepped off the ship, and for the emperor, for Tokuhito, who had been born into impossible circumstances, placed on a throne at 3 years old, carried through battles and sea crossings, and the chaos of a world collapsing, and who had died at 8 years old, in the cold water of Dan-no-ura, in his grandmother's arms. Her son, she prayed for him every day. She would pray for him for the rest of her life. Part 9. A year passed, perhaps a little more. The mountain valley kept its rhythms. The seasons turned in Ohara, as they turned everywhere, but more visibly, because the mountains that enclosed the valley made the colors of each season more concentrated, more specific, the green of summer richer, and the gold of autumn deeper than the same colors in the open city. She watched them turn. She prayed. She gathered the valley flowers. She maintained the temple. The news from the capital reached her, when it reached her, through the attendants who occasionally made the journey, down the mountain road, and into the city. The new order was establishing itself. Yoritomo in the east was building the administrative apparatus that would eventually become the military government at Kamakura, the government that would govern Japan for the next century and more. A new emperor had been enthroned. One of the ancient aristocratic families had managed this, the succession that the Taira could no longer control. The world was moving on. She was in the mountain valley. In the summer of 1186, the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa came to Ohara. Go-Shirakawa was a complicated man. He had been the most politically experienced figure. In Japan for 3 decades, the retired emperor who had never quite retired, who had managed the shifting politics of the imperial court through the rise of the Taira and the collapse of the Taira and the rise of the Minamoto, with a combination of shrewdness and flexibility that had kept him alive and relevant through circumstances that had killed or destroyed almost everyone else who had tried to navigate them. He had been her father-in-law. His son Takakura had been her husband. His grandson had been the emperor who died. In her arms at Dan-no-ura, he was not her enemy, but he was also not simply her friend. He was a political creature, visiting a woman who had left politics, and the visit was both personal and something more than personal. The procession came up the mountain road. In the summer, it was not the grand procession that a retired emperor's progress would normally have involved. The accounts describe something smaller, more restrained, a journey made with a degree of informality. That suggests Go-Shirakawa was not making an official progress, but something closer to a personal pilgrimage. He came to see her. He had heard about the life she was living. He had heard about the temple in the valley, the small group of women, the daily prayers, the gathering of mountain flowers. He came. She received him. The accounts are careful here, careful in the way that Japanese literary accounts are often careful about the emotional content of scenes that are emotionally charged, which is to say, they give you the details and let the details speak. The hermitage was poor. This is mentioned. The buildings were simple. The ground was covered with pine needles. The garden had been kept, but had the austere quality of a garden maintained by people with other priorities. He saw her in her nun's robes, the plain cloth. That was the uniform of the renunciate. Her hair was short. She had no ornament. She had nothing of the elaborate presentation that had surrounded her in the years of the court. He wept. This is in the accounts. He wept when he saw her, and the accounts suggest that his weeping was genuine, not performative, not the formal expression of sentiment that the Heian court had codified into a set of expected gestures. He wept because of what he saw in the difference between what she was now and what she had been. The daughter of Kiyomori, the wife of his son, the mother of the child emperor, the woman who had held the world at the center of her hands and had lost it entirely and had come to this mountain valley and this simple building and these plain robes. He had been partly responsible for the circumstances that had brought her here. The accounts do not say this explicitly. They do not need to. She told him about her life, not the facts of it. The facts were visible. She told him about what it had been, what it meant, how she understood it, from inside it. The tale she told is the heart of the last chapter of the Heike, the section called the Kenjo no Maki, the chapter of initiation, and it is one of the strangest and most beautiful passages in Japanese literature. She told him about the 6 realms. The 6 realms are a concept from Buddhist cosmology, the 6 states of existence that a being can inhabit in the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Hell, the realm of the hungry ghosts, the realm of animals, the realm of fighting spirits, the realm of humans, the realm of heaven. Most people live their entire lives in one of these realms, moving between them. Only at death and rebirth, cycling through the possibilities of existence over many lifetimes. She said that she had lived through all 6 of them in a single lifetime, in this life, in these 30 years. She began to tell him how. Part 10. She said that the realm of heaven was the beginning, the court in its full glory, the palace of the Heian Emperor, where every object was beautiful, and every moment was arranged, where the silk was always the right color, for the season and the occasion, where the music was always appropriate, to the emotional weather of the hour, where the people around her were accomplished and elegant, and attentive to the 1,000 small signals of refinement and status that governed life in that world. This was the heavenly realm, the realm of beings who live above the human world in a state of pleasure and ease, so complete that the suffering of ordinary existence does not penetrate it. She had lived there. She knew what it was. She knew also what the Buddhist tradition says about the heavenly realms, that they are temporary, that the beings who inhabit them exhaust their merit and fall back into the lower realms when the merit is spent. The Heian court was temporary. She had learned this. The realm of the fighting spirits was the war that had begun in the provinces and had moved west and had finally come for everything. The Asura realm in Buddhist cosmology is not hell exactly, but it is a realm of constant conflict, of beings who fight, not because fighting is necessary, but because fighting is what they are, because the nature of the Asura is to be in opposition, to meet every situation with aggression, to find in conflict the only form of life. They know how to live. She had been surrounded by this for years. The campaigns, the battles, the retreat, the ships, the sea. She had not been a fighter herself, but she had lived inside the fighting world, had been carried by it and through it, had understood it from the inside, had felt the way that constant conflict reshapes the people who live within it, makes them harder and faster and less attentive to the things that are not immediately relevant to survival. She had seen the Asura realm. She had lived inside it. The realm of animals was the flight. The chronicles of the Western campaign describe the Taira court in terms that are sometimes explicit about the degradation of conditions, the loss of the forms and rituals that had distinguished court life from ordinary life. The animal realm in Buddhist cosmology is not a realm of cruelty, but a realm of pure necessity, of existence organized entirely around basic needs, food and shelter and warmth and safety. The animals do not compose poetry, they do not arrange flowers, they do not burn incense and contemplate the quality of the autumn light. They eat, they sleep, they move away from danger, they move toward what sustains them. In the years of the flight, she had been reduced at times to something close to this. Not entirely. The court maintained its forms. She continued to write poetry. The incense was still burned when incense was available, but the necessities of survival had taken precedence over the forms of civilization, in a way that she recognized, from the distance of the mountain valley, as the animal realm. The realm of hungry ghosts was the aftermath. The Heian cosmology of hungry ghosts describes beings whose desire is so intense and whose capacity for satisfaction is so limited that they are perpetually starving in a world that appears to offer food but never actually satisfies. Their mouths are small, their throats are narrow, their bellies are vast. They reach for sustenance but cannot consume enough of it to fill the emptiness inside. She said that in the period after Dan-no-ura, in the small house on the edge of Kyoto, before she came to the mountain valley, she had understood this hunger. Not hunger for food, hunger for the world that was gone, hunger for the son who was gone, hunger for the life that was gone, a hunger that could not be satisfied, because the things that would have satisfied it no longer existed. The realm of hell was the sea. She did not elaborate on this at length. She said it simply and let it sit. The moment of going into the water, the cold, the intention, the weight of the robes pulling her down, and then the pull in the hair, and the being pulled back, and arriving, wet and cold and gasping, into a world she had not wanted to return to. That was the realm of hell, not because of the cold, not because of the fear, but because of the coming back, because of the being returned to a world that had just taken everything, and that she had tried to leave, and that had refused to let her go. She had not wanted to survive Dan-no-ura. The survival was the hell. The human realm, she said, was now. This, the valley, the temple, the plain robes, the daily prayers, the mountain flowers on the altar. The human realm in Buddhist cosmology is considered precious, precisely because it contains both suffering and the capacity for awareness. Animals suffer but cannot reflect on their suffering. Beings in heaven do not suffer enough to motivate the path to liberation, but humans suffer and know that they suffer, and can, if they choose, use that knowledge. As the beginning of the spiritual path, she was in the human realm. She was suffering, and she knew it, and she was using it. The prayer was real. The practice was real. The attention she brought to the flowers on the altar, and the quality of the morning light, and the sound of the water in the valley was real. Go-Shirakawa listened to all of this. He did not interrupt. He did not offer comfort or analysis. He listened in the way that the Heian world, at its best, knew how to listen with the full attention that the literary tradition had always required of its participants. When she finished, he wept again. The accounts say that the members of his retinue wept, the attendants wept, the women of the hermitage wept, the mountain valley held them all, in its particular silence, the silence of a place where the sound of the water is the only continuous thing. Part 11. Go-Shirakawa stayed for the day. He ate what the hermitage could offer him, which was simple food, mountain vegetables and rice, the food of a community that had dispensed with elaboration. He participated in the evening prayers. He sat in the temple and listened to the recitation of the sutras and the Nembutsu, the name of the Buddha repeated in the darkness, the sound that Kenreimon-in had been making her life around since the months after Dan-no-ura. And then, as the evening came down over the valley, he prepared to leave. The departure is one of the moments that the narrative of the Heike handles with particular care. The retired emperor, standing at the edge of the hermitage, the woman in the plain robes, standing at the gate of the temple, the attendants and the retinue, assembled in the autumn dusk. He turned back, More than once, the accounts say, he could not simply walk away. There was something in the sight of her that held him, that made the ordinary mechanics of leaving, more difficult than leaving usually is, that made each step away from the gate feel like a finality he was not ready for. What was he leaving? This is the question the narrative raises, and does not answer directly, which is the Heian method, the method of a literary tradition, that believe the most important things are communicated through what is not said, through the gap in the text, where the reader's imagination must do its necessary work. He was leaving a woman who had been part of his world for almost 20 years. He was leaving the last living connection to the son he had outlived, the Emperor Takakura, who had died at 21. Without seeing what happened to his clan and his son, he was leaving the woman whose child, his grandchild, had died in the sea. On a day when everyone's choices had been impossible, he was leaving her here, in the mountain valley, in the austere life. That was the only life. The new world had left her, and he was returning to the capital, to the politics and ceremonies, and the constant management of a world in transition to the life of a man who had always known how to survive. She watched him go. She watched the procession move down the mountain road toward the narrowing of the valley and the place where the road disappears into the cedar forest. She watched until she could no longer see the last figure in the procession. Then she went back into the temple. She sat before the image of Amida. She recited the name of the Buddha, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu. The sound of the water in the valley continued around her. The evening light came through the small windows of the temple and touched the altar and the flowers she had placed there, and the image of the Buddha with the particular quality of mountain evening light that was unlike any other light she had known. The years after the visit are the years the records are thinnest about. Not because nothing happened. Things happened. The seasons continued to turn. The prayers continued. The wildflowers of the mountain valley continued to bloom in their seasons and be gathered and placed at the altar. Awano Naishi and the other women continued their lives alongside her. They aged together. They learned together the particular wisdom that comes from living a contemplative life. Over many years, the knowledge that accumulates slowly in a person who is committed to paying attention. But the dramatic events were over. The narrative events, the things that would have given a chronicler something to chronicle, were over. What remained was not story, it was life. And this is something the Heike handles with extraordinary grace. The narrative does not fill the years with invented drama. It does not create events to justify the continuing attention. It acknowledges implicitly that the years after the great upheaval are years of a different kind of significance, years whose meaning is not in their events, but in their quality, in the texture of a life, lived in full awareness of everything that has been lost. She had been born at the center of the world. She was living at the edge of the mountain valley. This was not a diminishment, in the way that the world usually measures diminishment. This was a different kind of life, organized around different values, pursuing a different kind of completion. The prayer was the center. The flowers were the center. The sound of the water, and the quality of the light, and the slow accumulation of one day after another, in the cedar-scented silence of Ohara. She wrote poetry. A few poems survive from these years. They are poems about the mountain valley, about the seasons, about the particular emotions of a life lived in the kind of stillness she was living in. They are quiet poems, not poems of complaint, not poems of grief, though the grief is there, beneath them, the way the bedrock of a mountain valley is there beneath everything that grows above it. They are poems of attention, poems that notice the precise thing worth noticing, and find the precise words for it. This was what the Heian tradition had spent centuries building, the capacity to notice and articulate the exact quality of a moment. She had that capacity. She used it in the mountain valley with the plain robes and the daily prayers and the flowers on the altar. She used the gift her education had given her. Part 12. The world outside the valley changed. Yoritomo consolidated his power in the east. The Kamakura government took shape, the military administration. That would govern Japan, from the eastern city, rather than the ancient capital. The court in Kyoto continued, because Japan had not ended, because emperors were still enthroned, and the ancient ceremonies were still performed, and the aristocratic families still organized their lives around the ritual calendar. But the balance had shifted. The court was now what it had always, theoretically been, but in practice had never quite been, the seat of ceremony and culture without the seat of actual power. The power was in Kamakura. The culture was in Kyoto. Japan had divided itself in a way that would take centuries to resolve. Go-Shirakawa navigated all of this. He was good at navigation. He had been navigating the impossible currents of Japanese politics for 30 years, and he continued to navigate them with the particular skill of a man who had learned early that survival requires flexibility, that the man who holds his position too rigidly in a world that is changing will be broken by the change. He corresponded with Yoritomo in the east. He maintained the ceremonial functions of the retired emperor. He continued to be relevant. Occasionally, in the years after his visit to Ohara, he sent messages to Kenreimon-in. The messages are not preserved, or if they are not easily found. But the connection persisted. He had not forgotten her. The visit to the mountain valley had not been the last time. She was present in his mind. The seasons in Ohara followed each other with the reliability that the mountain valley had always had. Winter was the hardest. The snow came down into the valley in a way that isolated it completely from the capital, that made the cedar forest into a wall of white and gray, and turned the sound of the water into something lower and slower as the cold affected the stream. The small buildings were cold. The plain robes were not warm. The women of the hermitage added layers as best they could, and continued the prayers, and kept the fires in the small hearths that the buildings had. Spring was the relief. The snow melted. The first flowers appeared in the specific sequence that the mountain valley followed. The plum first, while the snow was still retreating, then the cherries, and then the long progression of mountain wildflowers. That continued through summer into autumn. She knew this sequence. She had come to know it, the way you know the face of someone you have lived beside for years. Autumn was her season. The accounts that survive from the women of the hermitage suggest that autumn in Ohara was the time of the most intense beauty, the season when the maples turned colors so vivid that they seemed almost unnatural, the season when the light had that particular quality of autumn light that is clearer and more precise than the softer light of summer. She had written about autumn in the years of the court. She wrote about it differently now. The court poems of autumn were poems about melancholy, about the sense of things ending, about the specific emotion that the Japanese call monono aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of beautiful things. The mountain poems of autumn were about the same things, but from the other side, from a position. That had already lost everything, that new impermanence, not as a theoretical truth, but as a lived experience that could look at the red maples of Ohara and find in their brightness not the fear of coming darkness, but the grace of the light while it lasted. She was not healed. This is important to say. The Heian literary tradition, in its handling of her story, does not sentimentalize her. It does not suggest that the mountain life erased the losses or transformed the grief into something easier to bear. The grief was there. It would always be there. The emperor was in the sea. He was always in the sea. The prayers she said for him every day were the acknowledgement of that fact, not the remedy for it. What the mountain life gave her was not the end of grief, but the space to grieve properly, the structure that made grief bearable, the daily rhythms that gave the formless weight of loss a form it could inhabit without destroying the person it inhabited. The prayer was work. This is something that people outside contemplative traditions sometimes miss about them. The prayer is not passive. The nembutsu is not simply a sound one makes with one's mouth. It is a practice. It requires attention. It requires the daily commitment to bring the distracted mind back to the single point of the name. She practiced this every day, morning and evening. The name of Amida, the intention behind the name, the faith that the intention is not directed into nothing, that the Buddha's compassion is as real as the grief, that the light of the pure land reaches even into the mountain valley, where a woman in plain robes says the name of the Buddha in the sound of the water. She did not know if this was true. She acted as if it were. This is perhaps what faith is. Part 13. Go-Shirakawa died in 1192. He was 65 years old. He had been the dominant political figure in Japan for 3 decades, the retired emperor who had outlasted every political arrangement that Japan had produced. In the second half of the 12th century, the man who had watched the Taira rise and fall, the Minamoto consolidate, the imperial court transform itself from the center of actual power to the center of ceremonial authority, and who had found a way to remain relevant through all of it. He had been her father-in-law. He had wept at her gate. He had listened to the 6 realms. He was gone. The news of his death reached the mountain valley in the way that all news reached the mountain valley through the intermediaries who traveled the road between the capital and Ohara. She received it. What she felt is not recorded in the way that feelings are usually recorded, not in direct statement, not in the form of a reported reaction. What the accounts give is the poetry, a poem she wrote after learning of Go-Shirakawa's death, that places his death in relation to the continuing presence of the mountain valley, the eternal indifference of the seasons, the fact that the autumn maples would continue to turn their colors, regardless of the political history of the world below. The poem does not mourn him directly. It mourns the accumulation, the ongoing subtraction of the people who had known her in the world she had come from. With Go-Shirakawa gone, she had fewer and fewer connections to the world before. Takakura, her husband, had died young. Kiyomori, her father, had died before the war ended. The emperor, her son, had gone into the sea. Most of the Taira men who had survived Dan-no-ura had been killed or exiled afterward, the Minamoto completing their victory by removing the people who might have organized resistance. The women who had survived were in mountain valleys of their own, in convents and hermitages, scattered across the country, each one carrying her portion of what had been, and making what she could of it. Awano Naishi was still there. Of all the women who had come with her, from the capital, Awano Naishi had been the most constant. She had been in the palace. When Kenreimon-in was the Empress, she had been in the Western Sea during the years of the campaign. She had been at Dan-no-ura. She had survived, and followed her mistress to the mountain valley, and stayed. They had prayed together for 7 years now. They had gathered flowers together. They had watched the seasons turn together in the enclosed world of Ohara. The relationship between them was not, by the usual terms, equal. Awano Naishi had always been an attendant, a member of the household, not a peer, but the plain robes change things. The shared prayer changes things. The shared years of grief and attention and daily life in small spaces create a kind of equality that the hierarchies of the court do not. They were companions. They were sisters in the way that people who have survived the same thing together become sisters. The temple continued. Pilgrims sometimes came. The road from the capital to Ohara was not a famous pilgrimage route, but the temple was known, and people who were making the broader circuit of mountain temples north of the capital sometimes stopped. She received them when she could. She participated in the services that the presence of pilgrims required. She was, by this point, the senior figure of the hermitage, the woman around whose practice the community had organized itself, the one whose presence gave the place its particular weight. She was not performing. She was not maintaining a role. She was simply the woman who had been there longest, and who prayed most consistently, and who understood, by this point, something about what the prayer was for, and what it could and could not do. The Shibazuke no Densetsu. There is a legend attached to her years in Ohara that is told to visitors to the valley today. The legend says that she gave the people of the valley the recipe for the preserved vegetables that would become one of Kyoto's most famous foods. The vegetables of the mountain valley, preserved in salt and the purple leaves of the shiso plant, the combination that produces the deep purple color, and the particular sour-salty taste that has been associated with Ohara for 800 years. Whether she actually gave the recipe to anyone, whether there was a recipe to give, whether the legend preserves any historical fact at all, is not something the historians can resolve. What the legend preserves is the sense of her that the people of Ohara maintained across the centuries, a woman who was present, who was part of the valley's life, who gave something to the people around her, even in the extremity of her circumstances, a woman who was not merely suffering, but living. Part 14. The date of her death is not precisely known. This is appropriate somehow. The life she chose was a life that had moved away from the precise recording of dates and events and official moments. The Heian court had kept records. The lives of emperors and ministers were documented with the obsessive specificity of a civilization that believed that the accurate recording of things was itself a form of power. The hermitage in Ohara did not keep those kinds of records. The best estimate is that she died sometime in the 1190s, probably between 1191 and 1195. She was somewhere between her mid-30s and early 40s. She had lived longer after Dan-no-ura than most people expected her to live. The accounts of her final period have the quality of things, remembered rather than recorded, the quality of oral transmission, of information that passed from person to person. Over the years between her death and the writing of the Heike in its current form, what they convey is a woman who died as she had lived, in the years of the valley, in prayer, in the daily rhythms of the religious life, in the specific attention to the small things, that the contemplative life makes large. The tradition says that she died facing west. In the Pure Land Buddhist tradition, the west is the direction of the Pure Land of Amida, the direction from which the Buddha's compassion flows toward the world of suffering. To face west at death is to orient oneself toward liberation, to turn the dying body in the direction of the destination. She faced west. She recited the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, the name of the Buddha, in the mouth of the woman who had been born at the center of the most powerful and most beautiful court in Japan, who had been made an empress at 16, who had given birth to an emperor at 23, who had gone into the sea at 30 and been pulled back and brought to this valley and this temple and this prayer, Namu Amida Butsu, the name. That was the container for everything. That had no other container. Awano Naishi was with her. She had always been with her. She would continue for some years after to tend the temple and keep the prayers and maintain the garden in the mountain valley. The account suggests that Awano Naishi understood her role as the continuation of something, as the keeping alive of a practice. That did not die with its practitioner, but persisted in the place and the prayers and the flowers on the altar. The temple in Ohara still exists. Jakko-in, the temple of still light. It has burned and been rebuilt, most recently in the year 2000, when a fire, set deliberately, destroyed the main hall and damaged many of the structures. That had survived. From the centuries of her connection to the place, the fire was a loss. The rebuilding was a statement. The temple was rebuilt because it contains something that cannot be lost even when it burns, the specific quality of intention. That has accumulated in a place over 800 years of continuous prayer. She prayed here, others prayed after her. Others pray there now. The mountain valley holds the accumulated attention of 8 centuries of people who came here because they needed what the valley offers. The Heike ends with her, the great narrative of the war between the Taira and the Minamoto, the story of the rise and fall of the most powerful warrior family in Japan, the account of the battles and the politics and the poetry and the deaths. All of it ends, not with a battle, and not with a political settlement, and not with the consolidation of power. In the East, it ends with a woman in a mountain valley praying. This is a deliberate choice. The Heike is a work of Buddhist literature, as much as it is a work of military history and the Buddhist understanding. It is trying to convey is not that power wins, or that the righteous triumph, or that history moves toward justice. It is trying to convey something more difficult and more true, that everything passes, that the sounds of the great bell of the temple of Gion-shoja announce this truth at every ringing, that the colors of the flowers of Sarasoju demonstrate this truth at every falling, and that the appropriate response to the passing of everything is not despair, but prayer, not the aggressive assertion of meaning, but the patient accumulation of attention, not the pursuit of power, but the cultivation of compassion. She had learned this in the mountain valley, in the plain robes, with the flowers on the altar, and the water in the valley, and the nembutsu on her lips, in the evening light. She had learned it the hard way. She had learned it completely. Part 15. The sound of the great bell of the temple of Gion-shoja echoes among all things. The colors of the flowers of Sarasoju reveal the truth that the prosperous must decline, the proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last. They are as dust before the wind. This is the opening of the Heike. 800 years of readers have known these words. They have been read aloud and sung and recited from memory by generations of people who found in them the precise articulation of something they had always known, but had not previously found words for, the impermanence of things, not as a philosophical position, to be argued for or against, but as the simplest and most verifiable fact about the world, the fact that the things we build, the things we love, the things we fill with meaning, are temporary, all of them, everyone. She knew this. She knew it before the war. She had been educated in a tradition that made the awareness of impermanence central to its aesthetic, that wrote poetry about the falling of blossoms, specifically because the falling is the point, specifically because the beauty that arrives and departs is more beautiful than a beauty that simply persists. But she knew it differently after. There is a difference between knowing impermanence as a truth one has been taught, and knowing it as a truth one has lived, between the educated understanding of the person who has read about loss and the embodied understanding of the person who has lost. She lost everything: the father, the husband, the child, the court, the silk, the music, the world. She lost it all, and she came to the mountain valley, and she prayed, and she survived. The Heike is sometimes described as a story about the Taira and the Minamoto, as a war narrative, as a record of the battles that transformed Japan from the court civilization of the Heian period to the warrior civilization of the medieval period. These things are true. The Heike contains all of this, but the Heike ends with her, and the ending it chooses is not the ending of a war narrative. It is the ending of something else, something that the Japanese literary tradition has always been better at than most literary traditions, of the story of what happens to the person who survives after the story everyone else was telling is over. She was Kenreimon-in. She was the daughter of Kiyomori, and the wife of Takakura, and the mother of Antoku Tenno, and the woman who went into the sea at Dan-no-ura and was pulled back. She was also Tokuko, the girl born in 1155, to a father whose ambitions were equal to his world and a little beyond it, who grew up in the silk and incense of the Heian court, who learned to see the precise quality of things and to find the precise words for them. She was both of these, the title and the person, the ceremony and the woman inside it. The Heike gives her back her person. At the end, it strips away the titles and the ceremonies and the political significance and leaves the woman in the mountain valley, in the plain robes, with the flowers on the altar and the nembutsu on her lips. The pure land she was praying toward is not a place on a map. The pure land of Amida, in the Buddhist imagination, is not a geographic location, but a state of being, a condition of existence, in which the causes of suffering have been removed, in which the distorting effects of greed and hatred and delusion are no longer operative, in which the nature of things can be perceived clearly for the first time. She did not know if she would reach it. She did not know if it was the kind of thing one reaches. She prayed toward it anyway. She prayed toward it every day in the mountain valley, with the sound of the water and the flowers on the altar and the light coming through the small windows of the temple and touching everything it touched with the particular quality of still light that gives the temple its name. Still light, not the dramatic light of battles, not the brilliant light of the Heian court in its silk and ceremony. Still light, the light that remains after everything else has passed through and gone. She prayed here. She survived here. She found in this place the particular form of peace that is available To a person who has lost everything and has chosen, in the aftermath, to remain present, to pay attention, to gather the small flowers of the mountain valley and place them at the altar and say the name of the Buddha, in the sound of the water, in the still light of the evening, the mountain valley holds all of it. The water continues to move. The cedar forest stands at the edge of the light, and somewhere in the quiet of Ohara, the name of the Buddha is still being said.